Beis, Mishnah Gimel. The Mishnah continues the theme that we started at the beginning of the Perek, Bameh Madlikin, what you can use, which wicks you can use to light Hadlokas Neiros, Shabbos candles. And the Mishnah says as follows: Kol hayoytze min ha'etz ein madlikin bo, ela pishton. Anything which literally comes from a tree, any product of a tree, ein madlikin bo, you can't use to light for Hadlokas Neiros on Shabbos. Ela pishton, the only thing you can use is flax. Now, really, flax is not a product of a tree, but the Bartanura explains we need to be told flax because there is a posuk in Yoshua which calls flax pishte eitz. And since I might have thought that it is the product of a tree, I might have thought that it should also be prohibited to use for Hadlokas Neiros. The Mishnah tells me that you can use flax to light Shabbos candles to use for your wick. The Mishnah continues: V'chol hayoytze min ha'etz eina metame tumas oyhalim ela pishton. Anything which comes from a tree, any product of a tree, cannot eina metame tumas oyhalim. There's no tumas oyhel. Ela pishton. Again, the exception is pishton. So, what is this talking about? The concept of tumas oyhel is set out in the Torah in Bamidbar Perek Yud Tes, and Pasuk Yud Daled reads as follows. The Pasuk says, Zois HaTorah, Adam ki yomas ba'oihel, a man who dies in a tent, Kol haba el ha'oihel, anyone who enters that tent, V'chol asher ba'oihel yitzma shivas yomim, and anything that is within the tent is tomei for 7 days. Now, the question is that it's clear from the Pasuk that anyone who walks into the tent and anything which is in the tent becomes tomei, has tumas oihel. But what about the actual tent itself? So the Pasuk, on one hand, the Pasuk Yudalet says, Kol asher ba'oihel, anything within it becomes tomei, which implies that the actual tent itself is not tomei. But yet the Pasuk, a few Pasukim later, Pasuk Yudches says, V'lokach ezoi v'toval b'mayim, you've got to take the hyssop and you've got to dip it into water, asher ish toher v'hizza al ha'oihel, and sprinkle it upon the tent, and on the nefashos that were there. So clearly the Pasuk is saying that you've got to actually sprinkle the water to purify the tent itself. So Pasuk Yudalet suggests that the tent is not tomei, but yet Pasuk Yudches says it is. So the Gemara says that it means as follows. It derives the following halachas, if you like, from this stira. The Gemara in Shabbos Kaf Ches Amud Aleph says like this: any fixed structure, any oihel, which is a fixed structure, regardless of the material it uses, whether it's eitz or other products, does not become tomei. However, the exception is pishton. The exception is if the tent is made out of pishton. And how do we know that? Because there we have a gzeres hakosov. It says in the pasuk v'hizo al ha'oihel, which we just mentioned, and the Gemara makes a gzeres shava. It says oihel min mishkan. It says in the Mishkan in Shmos Mem Pasuk Yutes, vayifrosh es ha'oihel al ha'mishkan. You got to spread out the oihel al ha'mishkan. Ma oihel ha'omer b'mishkan. Just like the oihel that was in the Mishkan, lo hoyboy dov hayotzim min ha'etz ela pishton. There was no wood derivative, but there was only pishton. Like it says, Esa Yirius Sheish Moshzor, it was made out of Sheish Moshzor, twisted linen, and Sheish is flax. That's Pishton. Af Oyhel Ha'amu B'Tuma Hainu Shel Pishton. So too, the Oyhel, which is said in the context of Tuma, is also made out of flax. Fine. So the Mishnah carries on. Psilas HaBeged, a wick made out of a piece of cloth. Shekiplo V'loi Hivhavo. You folded it, you twisted it. So you have a piece of cloth, and you twisted it to make it into the shape of a wick. V'loi hivhava, but you didn't singe it. In those days, they would take a cloth and they would singe the end of it so that it would be much easier to light. So you've taken a beget, a piece of cloth, and you've twisted it, but you haven't singed it yet. Can you use that for Hadlokas Neiros? Rabbi Eliezer oimer tameo. Rabbi Eliezer says that this piece of wick, which has been twisted, is tameo, becomes tomei. Ve'ein madlikin bon, you cannot use it for Hadlokas Neiros on Shabbos. Rabbi Kiva oimer, Rabbi Kiva says tahira. The actual cloth is tahir. Umadlikin bo, and you're allowed to light with it on Shabbos. What is the machlikas about? So the Mefarshim explain that the issue is as follows. when you have this piece of cloth, we're talking about a piece of cloth which is exactly 3 by 3 etzbois. That is the minimum shear, the minimum dimensions for the cloth to be considered to have the legal status of a beged. Less than that is not considered a beged. So Rabbi Eliezer holds that this minimum cloth, when you singed it, if you've twisted it and it is rolled down to a small dimension, because you didn't singe it, because lo hivhava, that means it's not going to light properly. So Rabbi Eliezer says it's tameo. Because you didn't singe it, that means it's still considered a piece of cloth which is 3 by 3 etzbois, 3 by 3 fingers, and therefore it's still got the status of a beged. And because you didn't singe it, you cannot use it for hadlokas neris. So that's what the Mishnah says. Rabbi Eliezer omer tameo. It's still tameo because although you twisted it into a thin sort of wick shape, it's still got the status of a beged because it's still, if you roll it out, it's still 3 by 3 etzbois because you didn't singe it. Had you singed it, that would have diminished the shear to less than 3 by 3 etzbois. And you ain't madlikim, but you can't light it because you didn't singe it. Because you didn't singe it, it's not going to light very well, and therefore it's ineffective for hadlokas neris on Shabbos. Rabbi Akiva omer tahira. Why? Rabbi Akiva says, excuse me, Rabbi Akiva says tahira is not makabel tuma because when the very twisting itself reduces the shear from 3 by 3 etzbois. It's no longer considered a beged. The very twisting reduces it to a shear less than 3 by 3 tefachim. You don't need to singe it to reduce it. The actual twisting of the cloth makes it into pachas mikashia. Umadlikim bo, and you're allowed to light with it. Why? Even though it's not singed and it won't light as well as it would do otherwise, nonetheless, the Kahati brings the Meiri who says that it would still light adequately, and this extra better lighting would only be effective if you do the singeing. It's not ma'akev, it's not the end of the world. And therefore, Rabbi Akiva's pshat Rabbi Akiva is Rabbi Akiva omer tahira. This wick is still tahor because is tahor now because you've reduced it to less than the shear of 3 by 3 etzbois. Umadlikin bo, because it lights adequately, and that's okay for Shabbos purposes. The Gemara gives a bit more information, if you like, about the machlokas Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva, and says we're talking about a very specific scenario. We're talking about, like I mentioned, a cloth which is exactly 3 by 3, but in addition, we're talking about a yontuf which falls out on Erev Shabbos. So Friday is yontuf. So we're talking about a scenario where the person twisted this cloth on Erev Shabbos, on Erev yontuf, on Thursday afternoon, and then on Friday afternoon, which is yontuf, he wants to light it. Now, the halacha is, there is a concept of muktzah. Everyone holds that, everyone follows Rabbi Yehuda, who says that shivrei kelim, broken kelim, are considered noilat, they're considered a new entity, they have a new sort of legal status, and therefore they're muktzah on Shabbos, you can't touch it. Now, they also hold that when you light Shabbos candles, you've got to light until the majority of the wick is actually a flame, is actually a light. And therefore, Rabbi Eliezer says you've got a problem. Rabbi Eliezer is of the opinion that since we are dealing with a piece of cloth which is exactly 3 by 3 etzbois, which is the minimum shear for the status of a beged, when you light the beginning of that beged, then you have automatically diminished it to less than 3 by 3, and therefore you've created shivrei kelim. So immediately on you lighting it, you've got a problem of nolad. And since the halacha is that you've got to hold the match there until the majority of the wick has actually caught a flame, you've got a problem of muktzah. You can't handle the wick itself. You can't be in contact with the wick. So therefore, Rabbi Eliezer is of the opinion that ein madlikin bo. Rabbi Akiva, however, argues, and he says that since you reduced this on Erev Yontov, it's not considered shivrei kelim, because you've already reduced it to less than 3 by 3 etzbois, and it's not creating a new shivrei kelim. It was already, if you like, shivrei kelim on Erev Yontov. And therefore, Rabbi Akiva says madlikin bo, because we're not talking about shivrei kelim over here, because the very twisting which took place on Erev Yontov on Thursday afternoon had already reduced it to pachas mikashir. So that is how the Gemara explains the machlokas Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Akiva. The Rabbi Eliezer says that you cannot use this twisted wick to light of hadlokas neris. Rabbi Akiva says that you can. That is the end of Mishnah Gimel.